Okay, Otavio Raposo asks, what is your real name? Kane Baker. Paul Dygert asks, can the manifest and scientific images of man be reconciled in your view? For those who don't know, this is Wilfrid Sellars. He came up with a distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image. I'm a little bit rusty on Sellars these days, but the basic idea is that these are two different images for understanding humans and our place in the world, and I guess the world more generally. The manifest image is our common sense, everyday understanding of other people. Humans are persons with thoughts and intentions and feelings. The scientific image, on the other hand, is the understanding that we have from science, particularly post-Enlightenment science, where we have a certain set of basic entities and properties which are thought to be kind of governed by natural laws, and then we explain the observable phenomena in terms of these entities governed by laws. So the scientific image involves the postulation of theoretical entities, right? Entities like chemical elements, forces, fields, neutrinos. It postulates these entities in the service of explanations, and that doesn't occur in the manifest image. The manifest image is the, I guess, directly observable world. I suppose it's sort of the distinction between like the world as it appears to us and the world as described by science. Maybe that two tables metaphor might be one helpful analogy. I mean, when we look at a table, it's hard and solid and you can hit it, right? But if you look at the scientific description of the table, well, it's built out of atoms, and atoms are almost entirely empty space. So it means the table is empty space, which I guess conflicts with our intuitive sense of what solidity and hardness is. So, I mean, the question: can the manifest and scientific images of man be reconciled in your view? You know, there's a prima facie clash between these images. Well, as I said in the last video, I'm an anti-realist. I don't think that science should be viewed as providing true descriptions of the world anyway, so I'm not really too worried about any clash. But I suppose to sort of say a bit more about this, I think it's pretty questionable whether we should draw this distinction, manifest image, scientific image, or whether we should put too much weight on this distinction in the first place. I mean, so one way of, I guess, putting a little bit of pressure on it is just to think about Sellars' own story, right? So Sellars' theory of the manifest image and scientific image. Well, Sellars is obviously not, this theory obviously isn't part of the scientific image, because it uses the language of the manifest image. When we talk about images and conceptions and worldviews and appearances and so on, that's the language of the manifest image, that's the language of folk psychology. On the other hand, it's not part of the manifest image either, because it clearly involves theoretical postulations, the manifest image and the scientific image. So, you know, I mean, these are clearly abstractions, and I suppose, you know, when we think about science and common sense maybe a bit more carefully, well, what's going on in science? Well, science is in constant flux, right? Science does sort of try to explain things in terms of a certain set of basic properties, but that's constantly changing. If you go back to Galileo and the Corpuscularians, they tried to explain everything in terms of primary qualities, well, what they would have called the primary qualities of shape and motion. And as soon as that kind of framework is seen as being insufficient to explain some phenomena, you know, once you hit some recalcitrant phenomena, and maybe you try to apply it, but if it continues to be recalcitrant, well, you just introduce some new properties, and I guess that's what happened with forces and fields. And I mean, actually today, I mean, the basic entities of science, shape, maybe motion, but certainly shape is kind of difficult to apply to something like an electron, to a quantum particle. Lots of weird things going on there. So okay, so if there's some clash between science and between scientific theories and the phenomena, I guess there's just a sort of assumption that, well, the phenomena will be reducible to our set of entities and laws eventually, and even if it isn't, just introduce some new entities and laws. The point of all of this is science is not complete. It's like it's an ongoing enterprise, right? It's not complete. The most we can say is that it will be complete in the long run, or I guess the ideal science or the end of science. That's when it will be complete. But of course, we're not yet there, and we don't really have any idea of what that will be. So from that point of view, you shouldn't really be too worried, I guess, about a clash between those images. As for common sense thinking, well, the manifest image, by stipulation, is something that does not involve theoretical postulations in order to explain things. Okay, well, that's fine as a definition, but does it fit common sense thinking? That doesn't seem to be the case to me. It seems to me that common sense thinking is constantly coming up with unobservable entities. I mean, so think about, I don't know, maybe moral values. We might say that somebody behaved in such a way because he was evil, because he has some moral defect. Or think about talk of unconscious mental states, or talk of possibility and necessity, or talk of design in the world. Not so popular anymore, but obviously that used to be a big part of common sense thinking. And I mean, that's all quite high level stuff, but just on a more everyday basis, talk about ghosts and UFOs, etc. So we've got these two images, but they both involve change, and I think what's really going on is people are constantly coming up with theoretical postulates to explain their experience, and it's just that science is a lot more stringent about what counts as an acceptable postulation. So, not really sure what my point is with this, actually. I'm sort of rambling. I guess what I'd say is, it's a useful metaphor, but the distinction between scientific image and manifest image, useful metaphor, but I wouldn't put too much weight on it, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, Philip Yang asks thoughts on the multiverse. Well, I don't know. I don't have many thoughts on the multiverse. I don't know the cosmology all that well. I mean, obviously, again, from the anti-realist point of view, even if the best theories of cosmology postulate a multiverse, you shouldn't believe in a multiverse. I mean, I suppose one thing that I guess I might as well say, since we're talking about the multiverse anyway, is this is something that is often used as a kind of explanation for our universe, for our universe, and it's like, well, a whole bunch of universes exist beyond this one. Our universe came from this underlying thing, the multiverse. Now, when we think about where did everything come from, why is there something rather than, why is there stuff rather than just nothing? There are ultimately only, well, it would seem there are ultimately only two options, right? I mean, either something just popped into existence one day, or something has existed eternally. I guess the multiverse view would be in the second camp, Actually, I suppose it wouldn't have to be. Anyway, my point is that I've always been quite okay with the idea that maybe the universe just popped into existence out of nothing. It's, I suppose, a little bit counterintuitive, but I don't know, why not? Why shouldn't it have popped into existence out of nothing? So I guess that's a thought related to the multiverse. But yeah, I don't have much to say about that question. PMU2 asks, could you talk about the moral sphere a la Robert Caine? I don't know, and I don't know what this is. Obviously I haven't read Robert Caine's work on the moral sphere. Somebody with a Russian name that I can't pronounce asks a Russian question, which I don't know how to read, so I put it into Google Translate, and it translates to soap from the table or bread from the scab. and I have no idea what that means, but bread from the scab sounds pretty gross. Soap from the table sounds quite useful, you know. Always need soap, don't you? So I'll go for that one. Sam asks, what makes a good writing sample? Specifically, are there some topics that are better to write on than others? And he asks what looks more impressive to admissions committees. Yeah, I'm not sure what to I don't know, I don't really want to give advice about something like this, you know. It sounds like it might be quite important. So, but I suppose when you think about what to put to an admissions committee, maybe depends on what the interests of the particular institution you're like applying to, or particular thing, you know, what are the interests of the admissions committee likely to be? Might be something to consider. I mean, more generally, I don't think the topic really matters that much. It's just as long as you write well and you've got interesting ideas. And a good source for writing well is Jim Pryor's guidelines on how to write a philosophy paper. So look up Jim Pryor, guidelines on writing a philosophy paper, and that's just a really great source for that. Sam also asks, my last question is, what in your view is the most complicated area in philosophy to understand? And he says, this is kind of tied into my writing sample question. I feel like writing on a very complicated topic would look most impressive. I would disagree with that very strongly. I think that being complicated is not a good thing at all. I think that when you write philosophy, you've got to try to use just plain language and try to make it understandable to not everybody, but the educated layperson. I mean, that's the ideal. You don't always achieve that ideal, because when you do philosophy, you're dealing with a topic which is very complex, right? And so sometimes it just ends up getting very complex and complicated because that's just the nature of what you're dealing with. But you don't want to make it more complicated than it needs to be. I think it's really, really crucial. One of the most important things about philosophical writing is to keep it simple and try to keep it concise and try to keep it understandable. Try to express yourself in a way that the educated layperson would understand. And actually, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I do the YouTube videos, I guess, is because I have to express the ideas in a way that an educated layperson would understand, because they're introductory videos. So I would not worry too much about making it complicated. Just focus on having good ideas and good arguments. And read that Jim Pryor website. Space Shuttle-Shouldering Lilypad says, as philosophy is fairly interdisciplinary, I'd suspect so, but are your interests and curiosities broad? I don't know, actually. I actually tend to be fairly obsessive about my interests. I'm not interested in a whole host of different things. I mean, beyond philosophy, my main interests academically are biology, obviously, astronomy, love astronomy, and then astrobiology, the marriage of those two things. I'm really into Doctor Who. I listen to a lot of music. I'm not sure what else. I don't know. I don't do a lot with my life, to be honest. I'm quite sort of boring. I don't go out and do a lot of things. So I suppose my interests aren't that broad, really. Stefan Travis asks, is there a school of postmodernism, or is it a general trend with no essential defining notions/teachings? Are there any significant thinkers who describe themselves as postmodernist? Well, within philosophy, at least, I would say it's more of a general trend, and it's a trend which I think is resisted by almost all philosophers. Postmodern. I know that I don't actually know, because I've not had any real experience of other subjects, but I've sort of heard that postmodernist type thinking is quite popular in other humanities. But I can say that philosophy, at least, has, I think, really resisted it pretty strongly. Most philosophers are not too happy with postmodernism. I mean, there are some. Kuhn was sometimes sort of considered to be the main postmodernist, but I think he wouldn't have wanted to be called that. I guess Feyerabend was. I think that most of my experience of postmodernist thinking comes more from reading some of the sociology of science. So things like the Edinburgh School, people like David Bloor, Barry Barnes. So I mean, traditionally, sociology of science, you can explain the, creation of scientific institutions, say, and you can give sociological explanations of false theories. So you might give a sociological explanation of why scientists accepted phrenology, which was a theory in psychology that had to do with like using the shape of the skull to try to try to infer people's personality traits. I think it was something like that, and you can give a sociological explanation of that, of course, in terms perhaps of, you might appeal to the racism at the time. I mean, that tended to be connected with racist views, obviously, because you're using people's appearances to try to determine their psychological traits. So that's, I guess, a sociological explanation of a false theory. Now, what the postmodernists, like the Edinburgh School, within the sociology of science did, was to say, well, you should treat both the false theories and what we consider to be the true theories in the same way. They should have the same kind of explanation. And I suppose it's quite obvious how, if you're thinking of false theories and what we would consider to be the true theories as arising from the same sort of mechanisms, I guess, that you might then be led to a relativistic postmodernist type view. But I'm not all that familiar with postmodernism in general, and I would say that I suppose it is a general trend, but it's not something that has had a lot of influence on philosophy, at least in the Western analytic tradition. I guess continental philosophy might be quite different, but Stoic Virtue Ethics Keep Reading asks, how would a person produce a system of correct moral reasoning, granted experience in life, understanding of morality, and knowledge of previous attempts to do so? Well, I would say I'm a pretty firm anti-realist. I don't think there's such a thing as a correct moral system. You do say here moral reasoning. Well, of course there is moral reasoning, but I would say that's just reasoning. It's reasoning applied to moral problems. So I suppose if you want to improve your moral reasoning, then you just have to improve reasoning. You have to learn the formal and informal fallacies, figure out how to construct arguments, figure out how to evaluate evidence properly, etc. Right? That's what will improve moral reasoning. You just apply those skills to moral questions. But I suppose if you remove the objectivism in your question, there's another question that's quite similar, which would be something like, what sort of methods should we use to arrive at a moral system, at a moral system that we can kind of accept. I mean, obviously, since I'm an anti-realist, I suppose if somebody were to say, well, look, I don't really care about having a kind of coherent moral system, I don't even care about moral reasoning, I'm just going to go with whatever feels right in the moment, I can't say there's anything incorrect about that. It's not wrong, but I would say that in practice it's not something that we want to do. First of all, because there are a whole bunch of cases where we don't have strong feelings. There are a whole bunch of cases where it's like we don't sort of know exactly how we feel about it, and so we want to appeal to some sort of broader principle in order to tell us what to do. So that's one reason why you want a moral system, even as an anti-realist. And the other thing is, of course, you want to persuade other people. If all I can say is, well, that's how I feel, then that's not going to be very persuasive to other people. So you want a fairly comprehensive sort of moral system, I guess, that you can then appeal to in moral arguments to try to persuade others. So from this point of view, then, what is the method of arriving at moral conclusions, I would say that it's probably, for me, a kind of reflective equilibrium. So the thought here is you essentially weigh your intuitions about particular cases against general principles, general rules. So suppose, for instance, that we have like a principle along the lines of the right action is whatever maximizes happiness. I mean, that might seem initially pretty plausible, right? So let's say we accept this principle. The right action is whatever maximizes happiness. And this is a useful principle because we can then apply this principle in cases where we're unsure about what the right thing to do is. And then we can kind of appeal to this principle in moral arguments and so on. But what we can do in terms of evaluating whether this is a good principle to hold is you apply it to cases where you do have very strong views, and it will deliver the right results in some cases, but in some cases it may deliver the wrong results. Now, with a principle like the right action is whatever maximizes happiness, if you that kind of naive utilitarianism, well, you guys are probably familiar with many of the objections to that sort of utilitarianism. But just for example, imagine a guy comes into a hospital, and it just so happens that in the hospital there are 5 people who all need organs, different organs. You know, one guy needs kidneys, another guy needs a heart, another guy needs a liver. And this fellow who's just come into the hospital is compatible with all of them. And let's say as well that the guy who's come into the hospital is a hermit. Nobody knows about him. Nobody cares about him. Maybe he's even a bit, depressed himself. He's not very happy. Whereas the 5 people in the hospital, they're like great people. They're great cancer researchers and scientists, and they're going to do a lot of good for the world if they survive. Well, the utilitarian answer here, the naive utilitarian, would seem to have to say that we have to kill this guy who's come in the hospital. If you think the right action is whatever maximizes happiness, it seems like it would maximize happiness to kill the guy who came in, take his organs, and distribute them to the cancer researchers and scientists. I mean, it's kind of a silly example, but it makes the point, right? That would be a morally repugnant thing to do. And so our principle has generated an answer which is totally repugnant to us. And so what do? Well, we revise the principle. And in other cases, we might have the principle might generate what seems to be the wrong answer, but then we just reject that intuition. So basically, it's like weighing the intuition against the principles. When a principle generates a counterintuitive result, you can either revise the principle or reject the intuition. And you're going to go through this process of weighing them against each other, keeping in mind, of course, general theoretical considerations. In the case of morality, I suppose first of all, we want a system that is consistent. We want a system that is universalizable in some sense. We want to hold all people to the same kind of moral standards. And I suppose we want a system. Well, we don't want a principle that requires us to do the impossible, right? So ought must imply can. I mean, those are some general theoretical constraints on our principle that we have to keep in mind as we weigh the principles against intuitions. So that's, I guess, the method that I would adopt that when I think about morality. The Infamous asks, what are your thoughts on veganism as a moral baseline? I'm going to talk about veganism later, actually. Quite a few people asked about that. He also says he would like me to have a debate with Ask Yourself. I'm not sure what that sentence means. I assume that Ask Yourself is a person, but I don't know who that is. Although I am happy to talk to anybody. I'm not really much of a debater, to be honest. So I'm not sure. I guess it depends on what the conversation would be like. I'm always willing to have a conversation. I can disagree with people, obviously, but I don't know. I've never been that good in formal debates. The Infamous also asks, do you believe humans are similar to AI? If yes, to what extent? I guess we must be similar in some ways. Everything's similar to everything else in some ways. Well, what kind of AI do you have in mind there? I mean, there's the good old-fashioned AI, the Turing machine, computationalist type AI, and then there's, well, there are, I don't know exactly how many traditions there are, but there's people like Rodney Brooks who have a very different approach, non-representational, sort of focused more about acting in the world, that kind of AI. I guess my position is we just don't know yet. One thing I suppose I would say is, I mean, it's obviously quite clear that AI can simulate many human capacities, but I do wonder if even like the successors of AI are a problem for the general view that AI and humans have something important in common. So it's like we can build machines which engage in calculations with amazing efficiency. They can play chess to, I think, even better than humans now. Right? Computers, the best chess computers will beat humans every time these days, I think. And certainly when you look at a simple pocket calculator, it engages in these amazing calculations. And those sorts of successors, I suppose, the very fact that this kind of computationalist type of AI is so successful in those ways makes me a little bit skeptical that it has much to tell us about human intelligence. Just because, well, we're terrible at that kind of stuff, that mathematical, computational kind of stuff. And so that would seem to me to imply that there's something very importantly different between AI, I mean that kind of AI, and humans. And that seems to be a point that, I don't know, people don't attend to enough. But yeah, I mean, I mean, generally speaking, I don't really have a lot to say about AI. I think, yeah, I mean, there are some similarities, and but we just don't really at this point know exactly how far they go. All right. The Tyrant asks, can you make a video defending direct realism? I did make a video defending direct realism. It's called Perception, Direct Realism versus Representative Realism. I'd probably do it a bit differently these days. I'd want to say something about Gibson and ecological psychology and all that stuff, but the video that's there, I think, it basically covers the traditional philosophical arguments. So there's that. Trurl asks, what do you think, if any, are the most convincing examples of an analytic statement which is not necessary, and a necessary statement which is not analytic? Well, I have some problems with the analytic-synthetic distinction in general and with modality, so I think we'll skip that one. What is your favourite novel and why? And Yank the Roots also asked this. I don't have a favourite novel. I don't ever read fiction. My girlfriend is absolutely horrified by this because she's a writer and she loves fiction. She's constantly reading fiction, and I literally never read it. I like to tease her sometimes, actually. Just a few days ago, I tease her with my complete lack of knowledge of fiction, and just a few days ago, she had the book Wuthering Heights on her bed, and I said, it's really great, isn't it, that they wrote a whole book about that Kate Bush song. And she got really angry with me. Obviously, I know I know the song is based on the book, but anyway, I don't read fiction because I just don't have time, I guess. Actually, it's not so much that I don't have time; it's that I do so much reading of that I have to do for my course, for the videos, for philosophy. And I don't just read philosophy. I also, because I'm mainly interested in philosophy of science, I try to keep up with the sciences and with the history of science. I mean, there's a load I have to read, and it's just like, man, when I want to relax, I don't want to be reading again. I do so much reading as it is. So yeah, I don't have a favourite novel. Trurl also asks, do you have an opinion on AI risks? I think that it's much more likely that society will probably just collapse over the next couple of decades due to things like resource depletion and climate change and other environmental problems. And I'm not too worried about AI risks, because I kind of feel like there are far more serious problems at present. I suppose if technology were to continue, if I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, because I don't want society to collapse. If I'm wrong and society continues in the same direction and technology continues to expand, then maybe it would be a problem. But yeah, don't have much to say about that. Tydrin asks, do you have any views on the philosophy of time? I would take, I've said many times I'm an empiricist and an anti-realist, so obviously I have the same kind of view with respect to time. We just do not know, and probably never will know, the fundamental nature of time. Vinicius Rodgrigues asks, what are your goals with philosophy besides making videos? Professional career. Yeah, I'd quite like to have a professional career in philosophy, but it's pretty tough and might not happen. So who knows? We'll just have to see. Okay. Yizuz S Ortiz asks, what do I think about animal consciousness and what do I think about animal ethics? Yank the Roots asked for my views on veganism, which I guess would come in here, and the Infamous also asked for my views on this. So animal consciousness, first of all. I suppose I take a sort of common sense view of animal consciousness. I'm quite happy to say that, animals probably have feelings and certain basic emotions. It's like, I suppose, just look at their behaviour, look at the similarity, like the physical similarities between animals and humans. Just consider their sort of, role in the environment. It's not like a plant. Plant is just fixed, pretty much in the same position. Animals kind of move about just like we do. There are so many similarities there. It seems pretty clear that they experience pains and pleasures. It's like, if you were to deny, say, that a dog has a mind, if you were to just say that it's there's nothing there, just no consciousness at all, it's hard. It's like, well, why wouldn't, whatever it is that's leading you to deny that of a dog, why wouldn't you also deny it of all other humans, right? So I suppose I just take a common sense position there, which I think pretty implausible, it seems to me, to deny animal consciousness. Okay, so that leaves us with animal ethics and veganism, which is, that's kind of a big topic. Obviously, there's loads of different arguments on this. I suppose I'll comment on what I take to be the strongest argument for veganism, and I think it's probably the most popular as well. So, as I've sort of understood it, the basic argument is going to be something like this. So, premise one, the moral status of a being is determined by its cognitive capacities. Maybe that's a bit strong, actually. You might want to say that, I guess what makes it wrong to kill humans is their cognitive capacities, or mental capacities, let's say mental capacities. But, it's why is it wrong to kill humans? And it's going to be something to do with the mental capacities that we have, presumably. So let's say premise one is, the moral status determined by mental capacities, something like that. Premise two is that the mental capacities of many animals, like pigs and dogs and cows, are equal to or greater than the mental capacities of many humans, like human infants, the severely retarded, maybe people with Alzheimer's or brain damage, and so on. And so the conclusion you get is that either it's perfectly okay to kill human infants and kill people with severe brain damage, or it's not okay to to kill non-human animals. So, I mean, I suppose that actually the second premise that non-human animals, their mental capacities are sort of equal to or greater than. I suppose that's hard to make precise, but I think that's pretty much acceptable. I think, yeah, as I say, I accept animal consciousness and the, I guess, empirical evidence in terms of the sophistication of some animal emotions seems pretty persuasive to me. So I suppose the point of this argument then is that if we're going to say that it's okay to kill animals, but it's not okay to kill any humans, then what we need is some sort of property that all humans have that would make it wrong to kill them, but that all animals lack. I think, and then the problem here is going to emerge because of marginal cases like infants and the severely retarded. So that's, I think, a pretty powerful argument. I don't accept it, and the main reason why is because our responsibilities towards, it's not just that we have a negative responsibility, as it were, towards infants. It's not just that it would be wrong for us to kill them. We also have positive responsibilities to protect them. We're obligated, if we see an infant in some sort of danger or distress, there is an obligation there to intervene. If we see a dog about to attack a human infant, you've got to intervene and save the infant. And I mean, you know, in general, if you think about starvation and so on in other countries, we take it that there's some sort of obligation to try to stop that. And there are different ways you might, I guess, spell that out. I mean, maybe you think that each individual person has an obligation to give money to charities to stop starvation. I suppose a more common view would just be that, well, you know, governments should give a bit of foreign aid, stuff like that. But the point is that there is an obligation to protect humans, and that includes the so-called marginal cases, as it were, the infants and the severely retarded. So if you take the argument that I presented seriously, if you accept that argument, then you're going to have to say the same thing about animals, about pigs and dogs and deer, and that's going to entail massive interference in nature. It's going to entail a kind of policing nature. And I should say actually that there are some philosophers who've basically just accepted this, that we should police nature. I find that to be pretty morally repugnant, actually. And it's not just that we have no obligation to police nature, it's that we really shouldn't do that. I think, I don't know, maybe I'll have more environmentalist intuitions there. But I mean, certainly, it's one thing to say that we shouldn't kill animals. It's quite another thing to say that we should police nature so as to prevent things like predation. That's a much more radical conclusion. So I think that's a conclusion that people who endorse this kind of argument haven't quite dealt with. So what's my view then about animal ethics? Well, I would say that we can kind of define a sort of core moral community, and that includes every entity that has the sophisticated cognitive capacities like rationality, the ability to reflect on one's actions, the ability to plan for the future, maybe sophisticated language use, that kind of thing. That's the sort of core moral community, and then the basic moral rights, like the right to life, they would apply to anybody that is within the core moral community, plus any entity that is biologically descended from that community. That's my basic view there. Of course, in practice, that's going to end up, that means humans, but it could also apply to extraterrestrials. There might be some aliens out there that have sophisticated cognitive capacities. Now, obviously, I guess the main worry about this kind of view is going to be arbitrariness. Because it's like, well, why, right? Why should you? Okay, the core moral community part, that's probably fair enough, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that there is, I guess, a relevant distinction between entities that have rationality and entities that don't, right? But then why say that it's that basic moral rights are given to the core community plus anything biologically descended? Isn't that just arbitrary? And I guess you don't want to be arbitrary, because otherwise, how do you respond to somebody who says that we should only grant rights to white people? You can do what you want to other races. But I think, resist the claim of arbitrariness here for two reasons. I mean, first of all, because I'm quite attracted to the biological basis. I think there is, this biological relation seems quite appealing to me. But importantly, recall the general view that I explained a bit earlier. So I'm, as I said, an anti-realist, and the general method that I have for arriving at moral conclusions is reflexive equilibrium. And the point is that if we go for this argument and say that pigs and infants are morally equivalent, well then either, right, it's perfectly fine to allow infants to die, or you have to intervene in nature. You have to do pretty much everything you can to save pigs and other animals with similar mental capacities. Both of those conclusions, in my view, are totally repugnant, and so we should reject the principle that's led us to those conclusions, or we should revise whatever principle has led us to those conclusions. And so yeah, I mean, this view of core moral community plus whoever is biologically descended from the core moral community, I think fits. I think it's a reasonable sort of fit. It works with this reflective equilibrium method. Of course, it is, I suppose, just pretty much it ends up supporting the status quo. But then, from the point of view of reflective equilibrium, that's not a problem. That's actually quite a good thing, that it doesn't do too much violence to our intuitions. That's all, I think. I think those are all the questions that I got. Thank you to everybody. If there were questions there I didn't answer, I'm sorry, but I got loads, and so I may have missed some. But I think that was everything. Okay, goodbye.